The 9,398th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Republic of Korea to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Volker, Turk, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Ms. Elizabeth Salmon, Special Rapporteur on the Situation on Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Mr. Ilhyeok Kim, Civil Society Representative. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker, Turk. Let's see, they have the Republic. Is Mr. Turk on? I saw him on the video earlier.
I am here, but I'm not sure. I think you can see me now, Madam President.
Is he back here? Why don't you go ahead and start? We don't have you on our videos on the desk, but we do have you on the larger camera.
Madam President, members of the Council, this open debate is a welcome opportunity to reflect and act on the dire situation of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, not least as human rights underpin peace and security, humanitarian action, and development. Human suffering of such scale and magnitude engenders instability internally and has wider implications. And rarely has the DPRK been more painfully closed to the outside world than it is today. This is a result of government policies that were initially linked to containing the COVID-19 pandemic, but which have grown even more extensive as the pandemic has waned. Information collected by my office, including through interviews and from public information issued by the government itself, indicates increasing repression of the rights to freedom of expression, privacy and movement, the persistence of widespread forced labor practices, and a worsening situation for economic and social rights due to the closure of markets and other forms of income generation. Anyone who views so-called reactionary ideology and culture, a term used for information from abroad and in particular the Republic of Korea, may now face imprisonment of 5 to 15 years. Any person found to have distributed such content faces life imprisonment or even the death penalty. A travel permit system enables the state to control all travel within the country. It imposes prison terms for up to 3 months without trial and in a state labor camp for violating travel orders. Following the closure of the country's borders in response to the pandemic, border guards were explicitly ordered to use lethal force against people approaching the border without prior notice. Since the border shutdown, only a handful of people have managed to leave the DPRK. Widespread imposition of forced labor by the state has continued during the recent border closures. According to our information, state-run institutions have continued to rely on forced mobilization of men and women without pay to maintain the operation of key sectors of the economy, such as construction, mining, and agricultural production. This long-standing and profoundly disturbing practice of forced mobilization has extended to children, as noted by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. In interviews, a number of men sent to work in other countries for the purpose of generating income for the state described conditions that are tantamount to forced labor. These include extensive surveillance, physically arduous and sometimes dangerous work, minimal health and safety measures, long working hours without breaks or holidays, and inadequate remuneration, as the vast majority of their wage is taken by the state. Within the country, markets and other private means of generating income have been largely shut down, and such activity is increasingly criminalized. This sharply constrains the ability of people to provide for themselves and for their families. Given the limits of state-run economic institutions, many people appear to be facing extreme hunger, as well as acute shortages of medication. In March 2023, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization noted, and I quote, that a large portion of the population suffers from low levels of food consumption and poor dietary diversity, with food security expected to remain fragile in light of persisting economic constraints and agricultural shortfalls. There are reports that starvation exists in parts of the country. The authorities acknowledge some of the challenges and have indicated that they are open to international cooperation to address them. However, to date, offers of humanitarian support have been largely rebuffed or made impossible owing to border closures. International humanitarian actors, including the United Nations country team, remain barred from the country, along with almost all other foreign nationals. Madam President, while in the past the people of the DPRK have endured periods of severe economic difficulty and at other times severe repression of their rights, currently they appear to be suffering both. According to our information, people are becoming increasingly desperate as informal markets and other coping mechanisms are dismantled, while their fear of state surveillance, arrest, interrogation, and detention has increased. This situation follows decades of chronic human rights violations, some of which the government has acknowledged. They have been catalogued in detail by the Commission of Inquiry that was mandated by the Human Rights Council a decade ago, and whose groundbreaking report contributed to the creation of this agenda item. Recent reports of the Secretary General to the General Assembly, reports by my office to the Human Rights Council, and the work of the Special Rapporteur have added to this litany of suffering. The government's surveillance over its citizens at home and abroad has grown to an intensity rarely seen in other countries. People's rights to privacy are systematically violated. Homes are subjected to random searches. Neighbors and family members are encouraged to report on each other. Punishments for even minor infractions can be severe, possibly amounting to gross violations of human rights. The exercise of fundamental human rights to freedom of expression, thought, conscience, religion, peaceful assembly, and association may be sanctioned by extrajudicial killing, enforced disappearance into one of the country's political prisons, or other severely disproportionate punitive measures. Thousands of enforced disappearances have been perpetrated by the state over the past 70 years, including of Koreans from both north and south of the Korean demilitarized zone, and the abduction of other foreigners, mostly Japanese nationals. I sympathize deeply with the families of those who were abducted or disappeared, and who now are or would be aged in their 80s and 90s. It is imperative that we exert all efforts to ensure some measure of justice before it is too late. The same consideration applies to the North-South cross-border family reunion scheme that has given hope and deeply valued connection to tens of thousands of separated families. This scheme has been cruelly stalled since 2018 due to political tensions. For all the victims of the many violations and crimes committed over decades in and by the DPRK, accountability is essential. In the absence of meaningful actions towards this goal by the authorities of the state, I encourage action by other member states or in international fora, including the International Criminal Court. Non-judicial forms of accountability must also be considered, including truth-telling, the recovery of remains, and reparations programs, which are particularly requested by victims during consultations that my staff held in Seoul. Meanwhile, my field presence in Seoul continues to monitor and document human rights violations in the DPRK and to explore pathways to accountability while preserving information that might be used for this purpose in a central repository. Madam President, it is estimated that thousands of North Koreans are currently at risk of being repatriated involuntarily to their home country, where they may be subjected to torture, arbitrary detention, or other serious human rights violations. The precarious human rights situation that I've just described means that they have an undeniable, compelling need for international protection. I therefore urge all states to refrain from forcibly repatriating North Koreans and to provide them with the required protections and humanitarian support. The persistence of severe, widespread, and long-standing human rights violations in the DPRK cannot be seen in isolation from peace and security issues on the peninsula and within the wider region. Many of the violations I've referred to stem directly from or support the increasing militarization of the DPRK. For example, the widespread use of forced labor, including labor in political prison camps, forced use of school children to collect harvest, the requirement for families to undertake labor and provide a quota of goods to the government, and confiscation of wages from overseas workers, all support the military apparatus of the state and its ability to build weapons. The UN Charter makes it clear that human rights violations of this order are a matter of international concern. Sustainable peace can only be built by advancing human rights and its corollaries, reconciliation, inclusion, and justice. The international human rights treaties and human rights bodies provide a shared framework to identify challenges, address disagreements, and measure progress, thus helping to reduce tensions both within and between states. In the past, the DPRK was an active participant in a number of these mechanisms, despite its criticisms of various aspects of their work. Regrettably, in recent years, it has cut itself off from these much-needed sources of dialogue and guidance. My office continues to encourage the government to respond positively to my offer of technical assistance. The next universal periodic review of the country in November 2024 provides a window of opportunity for engagement, for confidence building and progress. I also hope that the country will reopen to the world, paving the way for other forms of interactions with the United Nations. The return of the United Nations country team to Pyongyang and conclusion of a new partnership framework would be crucial to advancing coordinated work to address the suffering of the people of the DPRK. In the spirit of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I urge the authorities to engage in meaningful dialogue and to reset much-needed freedoms as a foundation for enduring peace. Thank you, Madam President.
Mr. Turk for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Elizabeth Salmon.
Madam President, Excellencies, it is my honor to brief the members of the Security Council and to bring to your attention the pain, of the people of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, whose human rights continue to have deteriorated under the current state of tensions and unprecedented isolation. The prolonged border shutdown, which started early in 2020, has brought increased hardship. The informal markets in the country, known in Korean as Jangmadang, have been significantly repressed, depriving a vast number of people from their livelihoods and preventing many from buying food. Women have been particularly affected given the rising involvement in commercial activities. Some people are starving. Others have died due to a combination of malnutrition, diseases, and lack of access to health care. Access to food, medicines, and health care remains a priority concern. Excellencies, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean Armistice Agreement signed in 1953. Yet, there is currently no visible sign of peacemaking on the horizon. On the contrary, the frozen conflict is being used to justify continued militarization within the DPRK with devastating effects on its people. Songun, the military-first policy, gives priority to the allocation of resources to the military, thereby reducing the limited resources for respecting and fulfilling the people's human rights. Militarization also promotes the systematic exploitation of the population. The leadership in the DPRK continues to demand its citizens to tighten their belts so that the available resources could be used to fund the nuclear and missiles program. It strengthens gender stereotypes regarding the roles and responsibilities of women within the family and weakens their political participation. It creates the ongoing demand for forced labor across the country and for workers sent abroad. It has caused the systematic abduction of its people and other nationals, notably from the Republic of Korea and Japan, creating cycles of separated families. And it has triggered economic sanctions with a detrimental impact on the people in the DPRK, in particular women and children. The international community must look again at the use and impact of such tools. My particular concern is the situation of women and girls. Women are detained in inhuman conditions and are subject to torture and ill treatment, forced labor, and gender-biased violence by state officials. Female escapees who are forcibly repatriated to the country are subject to strip searches and invasive body searches, aimed at searching for money hidden in their body cavities and genitals. Gender violence against women, including domestic violence and sexual violence, is prevalent, and impunity is widely accepted. Victims, survivors, have no access to reporting or protection mechanisms. Third countries must refrain from forced repatriation, complying with the principle of non-refoulement, which is customary in international law and applies to individuals at risk of being subject to torture and ill treatment regardless of their migration status. Madam President, Excellencies, I strongly encourage the members of the Security Council to consider peace beyond the absence of violence or fear of violence. Peace and security must be approached in a comprehensive manner, combining stability, equality, truth, and justice, guided by human rights norms. Similarly, the necessity of justice must be recognized. The members of the Security Council might discuss what the accountability mechanisms for human rights violations will look like. Member states are also encouraged to support victims and civil society organizations in their both judicial and non-judicial accountability efforts. The preparation for any possible peacemaking process needs to include women as decision makers, and this process needs to start now. Negotiations to end the state of conflict should include clear benchmarks on progress on human rights. For instance, a set number of country visits each year by special procedures mandate holders, which include access to detention facilities. A set number of family reunions per year, and the implementation of the recommendations that the DPRK accepted during the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. Madam President, Excellencies, we cannot remain indifferent. The pain is there. 7 decades have made it evident that neither continuing this status quo nor a build-up in military activities is an adequate response to the suffering of people in the DPRK or to creating an environment for sustainable peace in the Korean Peninsula. We must refocus international efforts to take steps to end the ongoing state of conflict, and we need to do so prioritizing the human rights of the population of the DPRK. I call upon the Security Council to place the protection of human rights at the center of a reinvigorated peace and security agenda. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Salmon for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Ilhyeok Kim.
Good morning. My name is Ilhyeok Kim. I was born and raised in a small village in North Korea. Due to my country's poverty, I was forced to do unpaid labor from my young age. When I should have been studying hard, instead, I was soaked in sweat while planting and harvesting crops. Most of the grain went to the military, and all we were left with was the worry of what we could eat the winter. Extreme pandemic restrictions have made North Korean lives harder than ever. And we are also facing a reign of fear that isolate North Koreans and harshly punish people just for accessing foreign information. Even when starved, the North Korean government has no policy to help us. The government turns our blood and sweat into luxurious life for the leadership and missiles that blast our hard work into the sky. We used to think that the money spent on just one missile could feed us for 3 months. But the government doesn't care and is only concerned with maintaining their power, developing nuclear weapons, and creating propaganda to justify their actions. Even with such hardship, North Koreans cannot express any dissatisfaction to their government. Our people have no human rights, no freedom of expressions, and no rule of law. So anyone who disagrees is taken to a political prison camp where they will do hard labor until they die, or they are simply shot to death. The North Korean government has eradicated basic human rights from my homeland. When my family left North Korea to go to South Korea, my father's sister knew we were leaving and said goodbye to us. North Korea's secret police found out and arrested, tortured, and beat her for several months because she didn't report our escape. My aunt ended up in a political prison camp for the supposed crime of not reporting on her older brother's family. At that time, she had a 5-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter, and she was forced to say her last goodbye. to our beloved children. I cannot understand how my aunt and 2 cousins could have deserved this fate. I desperately hope that these inhumane things will stop happening in North Korea. I hope with all of my heart that the day when all North Koreans can enjoy the same freedom that we take for granted will come one day sooner. Just as I now have the freedom to come here and talk with you. On that day, all North Koreans will be able to travel to the rest of the world and meet the people from Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Russia, Switzerland, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, United States, Albania, Brazil, China, Ecuador, French, Cuba, China. And we'll be able to work together for world peace and a better future for humanity. On this day, the people from your countries will come to know the true character and potential of people from my homeland. 9 years ago, Ambassador Oh Jun of the Republic of Korea addressed this council and said, "We only hope that one day in the future, when we look back on what we did today, we did the right thing for the people of North Korea. If you and I thought we can do for the rights and freedom of North Korean people, in the future, we'll be able to proudly say that we did the right thing. Until that day comes, I urge you to continue to care about North Korean people, to continue to discuss the human rights of the North Korean, and to work to overcome the North Korean people, the North Korean government's physical and digital self-isolation, so that people in my homeland can see, hear, and feel the vast and wonderful world that lies outside their borders. Lastly, I want to say something to the DPRK government in our language. 독재는 영원할 수 없습니다. 더 이상 죄짓지 말고 이제라도 인간다운 행동을 하시기 바랍니다. 우리 북한 사람들도 인간다운 삶을 스스로 선택할 수 있는 권리를 가진 사람들입니다. That means no tyranny lasts forever. Us North Koreans also have a right to choose lives of dignity for ourselves. So stop committing such crimes against our people and choose a path of humanity. Thank you.
For his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. Let me start by thanking High Commissioner Turk and Special Rapporteur Salmon for your sobering briefings and your recommendations to this Council. The human rights violations and abuses you detailed are so horrific, they're almost unfathomable. But today, we heard from someone who lived these horrors and who shared his story with the world. Mr. Kim, I'm inspired by you. I'm inspired by your bravery, by your speaking out. You have helped advance the dignity and the rights of people in the DPRK. And I thank you profusely for your presence today. And I hope all members of this council heard your appeal directly to all of us. Colleagues, this year we mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes that, and I quote, "the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom justice, and peace. The vast majority of the world and every Security Council member has signed on to this foundational document. And this council has repeatedly affirmed its responsibility to protect human rights, given its inherent connection to conflict and stability. Now this council has not always lived up to that responsibility, but there have been recent flashes of progress. In April, for example, we unanimously adopted a resolution condemning the Taliban's restrictions on women and girls. And last December, we adopted a resolution on Myanmar that called on all parties to respect human rights. Still, this council has been silent on a host of other human rights abuses, including abuses carried out by one of the most repressive and totalitarian states in the world, the DPRK. You all just heard from all three of our briefers who describe the situation that we are faced with from the DPRK. Inaction is unacceptable, which is why the United States joined Albania and Japan in requesting this long overdue meeting. This is an undeniable matter of international peace and security, one that demands the Council's attention, especially because the human rights situation in the DPRK has not improved since the UN Commission of Inquiry issued its landmark report almost a decade ago, which found the DPRK government had committed systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations, and that in many instances, the violations entailed crimes against humanity. Reports indicate the DPRK continues to hold more than 80,000 individuals in political prison camps, where according to reports, they are widely subjected to arbitrary or summary executions, torture, starvation, gender-based violence, forced abortions, and forced labor. The DPRK government has also engaged in acts of transnational repression against its own citizens and foreign nationals. The DPRK's activities abroad have included assassination, surveillance, intimidation, abduction, and forced repatriation, sometimes with the assistance of other governments, and sometimes without the consent of other governments, which shows the DPRK lack of respect for state sovereignty. Colleagues, we cannot have peace without human rights, and the DPRK is a case in point. Kim Jong-un's repressive totalitarian control of society and the systemic widespread denial of human rights and fundamental freedoms ensures the regime can expend inordinate public resources developing its unlawful WMD and ballistic missile programs without public objection. This war machine, which stands in violation of multiple Security Council resolutions, is powered by repression and cruelty. But make no mistake, the regime neglects the well-being of people in the DPRK. Its food distribution policies favors the military and lead to chronic malnourishment among its citizens. Pyongyang also relies on forced labor and the exploitation of workers domestically and overseas to power its unlawful weapons program. Security Council Resolution 2397 required all member states to repatriate DPRK nationals earning income in their jurisdiction no later than December 2019. Unfortunately, instead of repatriating some individuals and fulfilling their Security Council obligations, some council members have repatriated people who have fled the DPRK, people seeking a better life, people seeking freedom, people in need of protection like Mr. Kim. I recently met with 10 young defectors from the DPRK who risk everything for freedom. And I was brought to tears as they told me about their dangerous escapes, sometimes twice as they were returned after their first attempts. They told me about harrowing conditions from which they fled and what it's like to be separated from their loved ones. One defector said he wants nothing more than to see his dad again. He told me how much it pains him to not be able to wish his dad a happy birthday. But while the defectors I met are cut off from their country, they have never stopped dreaming of a brighter future for the DPRK. They've never stopped fighting for those who still live under tyranny. We must follow the example of these young activists, like Mr. Kim. The modern world has no place for the DPRK government's brutality, and the international community and this council must continue to speak out against this injustice and its destabilizing impact on regional and international peace and security. The United States has made human rights a key focus of our presidency of the Security Council this month, and we will continue to promote human rights and fundamental freedoms at home and around the world. No country has a perfect human rights record. We all have our flaws. But in open societies, people can protest. They can drive progress forward. In the DPRK, a closed, hermetically sealed country, everything is shrouded in secrecy. People are under constant surveillance, and those who speak out can be thrown in prison or worse, even executed. So we must give voice to the voiceless, and we must take up their cause. I suspect some in this chamber will shrug off Mr. Kim's brave testimony or call this meeting another demonstration of U.S. hostility. That is deeply cynical and it's absurd. This meeting has always had a singular objective: to fight for the rights of the people in the DPRK, to fight for international peace and security. And it is unfortunate that some continue to try to protect the DPRK government from international accountability. But courageous defectors, UN experts, reporters will continue to expose further abuses. They will continue to demand accountability. And this council must continue to call out the DPRK regime's human rights violations and abuses. So colleagues, let us work together, in the words of Mr. Kim, for world peace and for a better future for humanity. Thank you. I resume my functions as president of the council. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Let me start by thanking the US presidency and you personally, Madam President, for organizing this important meeting. I thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, for his insightful briefing, and we concur fully with his assessment on the importance of the meeting and the direct link of the human rights situation in DPRK with peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula and beyond. Madam Special Rapporteur, thank you for your sober assessment. Of all rapporteurs of the UN on human rights issues, you have something close to an impossible task, and we commend you for the efforts and the commitment in addressing the disastrous human rights situation in the most secretive and tyrannical state turned into an information black hole. Mr. Kim, I am personally deeply touched by your powerful account because it resonates to me personally, and I'm sure, to everyone who has lived under a brutal dictatorship. Thank you for being here to help us to seriously reflect on how the international community should react in the face of the brutal misery that over 25 million North Koreans continue to experience daily with no end in sight. Colleagues, the last meeting on this issue in the Council was held 6 years ago. Therefore, this meeting is long overdue and could not be timelier. We are not going back in time. We are just bringing the Council up to speed. Because as we heard, and clearly and explicitly by all our briefers, during these 6 long years, the situation of human rights in North Korea has not improved. It has worsened. The number of people suffering from violations has increased, and the collective misery brutally imposed by a draconian, paranoid, and criminal regime has expanded. Madam President, let me shortly explain why this meeting is necessary, important, timely, and useful. Because this meeting is a moment to shed a bit of light on the darkness of a country where the regime does not tolerate pluralism, where independent media, civil society organizations, and trade unions are banned, a country where all the basic liberties, including freedom of expression, public assembly, association, and religion are systematically banned. A regime that uses fear and inflicts collective punishment to silence dissidents, that routinely send those perceived as opponents to secretive political prison camps where they are subject to torture, starvation, and forced labor. It is the bizarre place in the world where the government decides on what you read, on what you watch, even on what you should think. And if, God forbid, you are caught watching a foreign movie not sanctioned by the government, or speaking to a foreigner, such reactionary behavior, quote unquote, as they call them, will be severely punished, including with death sentences. For all these reasons, this meeting is a strong message of solidarity with an entire population trapped inside a countrywide prison, and the message, we will not forget you. It is an expression of sympathy and support for all those who, after having escaped the labor camps, are praying not to be repatriated back to DPRK in compliance with the principle of non-refoulement. It is a manifestation of support for all political prisoners and all those forced to work in concentration camps. It is a meeting for all the malnourished children who are entitled to healthy upbringing, not starvation, who need quality education, not military parades, for all the women and girls forcibly trafficked and subject of sexual violence from high-ranking military officials in detention centers, held in inhumane conditions and deprived from food. Colleagues, this meeting is also a call to a regime whose priority and obsession is and remains militarization, more weapons, more missiles, more warmongering policies. The unlawful weapon of mass destruction and ballistic program are developed, and we know it, in open disregard of the Security Council decisions, and the systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations committed by the DPRK institutions and officials serve the DPRK's unlawful activities. Because the regime is stealing food on the family table, is denying medicine to the hospitals, is starving people in labor camps, is using children only to invest in its nuclear and ballistic program. These have been reported continuously by independent UN rapporteurs and other credible reports, and were confirmed this morning by the High Commissioner and other briefers. This is why this meeting is also another attempt to rally the Security Council to stand up against policies and actions that put in serious danger peace and security in the Korean Peninsula. And as the Special Rapporteur highlighted, the DPRK regime must be held accountable, not shielded in its repeated flagrant breaches of international law and human rights, because shielding the regime means being against the people. Madam President, there is so much more to say, but I would like to conclude with a few words, wishing that, in a way or another, they be heard somewhere in North Korea. And this is a personal account, like the one that we heard from Kim. A bit more than 3 decades ago, like most of my compatriots, I was living under a similar regime, just like the current one in North Korea, so paranoid that it had crumbled upon itself, totally self-isolated and forgotten in its madness, and having invested for decades in what it considered at that time to be the best defense weapons, bunkers. Hundreds of thousands of concrete monsters of all sides were built and planted everywhere, used as an effective propaganda tool to convince a recluse population I was part of, we could resist every foreign attack. An attack that never came because no one had an intention to attack my country, except for the need of the sick thoughts of the nomenclatura to subjugate its people with fear. When youth fomented change in the early 90s, when our part of the Berlin Wall fell, we discovered that the only things that we were left with were the absolute misery and the bunkers. Fast forward, and in the course of the 3 decades, my country has developed more than during the last 300 years. It did not happen by any miracle, but simply due to one simple thing. We understood that you can go faster and farther by investing in people, in rights, in freedoms, in cooperation with neighbors, and in openness with the world. And those who for decades were considered as our worst enemies turned out actually to be our best friends. If ever North Korea was looking for a lessons learned, this is one. Weapons will never change the country. They will never feed the population. They will never bring prosperity. Instead, freedom, rule of law, education, health, investment in human capital, cooperation and trade with neighbors will shorten the path to the future, a future North Koreans deserve. And they don't need to go far for this. Just have a look across the DMZ at the south. This is why, colleagues, as council members and friends, I hope, with the North Koreans, we should consider a duty to raise our voice against all the human rights violations because rights and their absence determine everything for people. Those we all have committed to put in the center of our attention and work, and as proven, they have a direct impact on peace and security in the DPRK and everywhere. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mr. Turk and Ms. Salmon for their insightful briefings. I also thank Mr. Ilhyeok Kim, a civil society representative, for sharing his first-hand account from North Korea. It is truly heartbreaking, and we appreciate his courage to be here with us today. Today, after nearly 6 years, we reconvene here in this chamber to discuss the human rights situation in North Korea, one of the most egregious in the world, and its implication for international peace and security. Over a decade ago, the UN Commission of Inquiry identified systematic, widespread, and gross violations of human rights in North Korea, many labeled as crimes against humanity. Today, as pointed out by briefers, we witness that these same troubling patterns persist. The dreadful human rights situation in North Korea remains stagnant, showing no improvement of even signs of it. Japan finds this deeply alarming and unacceptable. Their insights also underscore the Commission's assertion that North Korea is unparalleled in its human rights violations in the contemporary world. Madam President, the reason for this stagnation is clear. North Korea staunchly imposes on its people the regime's pursuits, in particular its unlawful nuclear and missile developments. This alone compellingly illustrates the inextricable link between North Korea's human rights abuses and its pursuit of militaristic ambitions. But it does not end there. The relevant Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions reveal another facet of North Korea's disturbing scheme: the exploitation of its people overseas. Sent to foreign shores, these individuals are trapped in a life of servitude, their efforts in directly supporting North Korea's unlawful nuclear and missile programs. Worse still is the regime's denial to people at home. North Korea has been diverting essential resources toward its unlawful development of nuclear weapons and missiles at the expense of the welfare of people in North Korea, while they have great unmet needs. According to the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2023, nearly half is undernourished in North Korea. That is a staggering number of 12 million people. How many mouths could have been fed? How many lives uplifted, including the young generation, had these resources been properly channeled? Madam President, for perspective, consider this. North Korea has launched a record number of 70 or more missiles last year, and they have already launched ICBM class ballistic missiles 4 times this year in violation of multiple Security Council resolutions, most likely capable of reaching all parts of Asia, Europe, North America, Africa, and even some of South America. North Korea has also indicated they will continue such unlawful and dangerous acts, including mass production of nuclear warheads. The intertwining of human rights violations with international peace and security cannot be more obvious in the case of North Korea. I must stress that addressing such deep concerns is clearly central to the mission of this Council. Madam President, please allow me to raise a particularly serious human rights violation by North Korea: abductions. Many Japanese citizens, including a girl as young as 13, were kidnapped by North Korean agents. The act of international abductions infringes on a nation's sovereignty and jeopardizes the well-being and safety of its citizens, thus posing a serious risk to the international community. The abductees remain trapped, their agonies renewed each passing day, and as High Commissioner Turk noted, with every tick of the clock, aging families despair, as their dreams of reunion remain unrealized. Many have unfortunately passed away, with the pain of separation as their last memory of their loved one. But Japan is not alone. The OHCHR recognizes nationals from the Republic of Korea, China, France, Lebanon, Malaysia, Romania, Singapore, and Thailand to have shared this sorrow. The urgency is palpable. I urge the international community to come together to achieve the speedy return of each and every abductee. Madam President, this year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. While strides have been made, the grave human rights landscape in North Korea and its unsettling implications for international peace and security stands out starkly. It is imperative that North Korea heeds the messages from this Council today. It is high time they embarked on tangible measures to address serious human rights violations, cease its unlawful nuclear and missile programs, fully comply with all relevant resolutions, and return to dialogue. At the same time, it falls upon this Council to consistently bring the situation in the DPRK to the fore until North Korea recalibrates their stance on human rights and genuinely commits to fostering international peace and security. We must continue our work. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I thank the High Commissioner Volker Turk and the Special Rapporteur Elizabeth Salmon for their informative briefings, and I would also like to commend the courage of Mr. Ilhyeok Kim for his moving testimony. Thank you for joining us. France unreservedly supports holding this meeting because human rights are one of the fundamental pillars of the United Nations, and the Security Council must continue to be seized of the mass systematic violations of human rights in North Korea. These violations weaken regional and international peace and security. Madam President, while the North Korean regime is continuing its nuclear and ballistic programs at an unprecedented pace, in defiance of all of the Security Council resolutions adopted in this chamber, the human rights situation in North Korea remains alarming. Despite repeated calls by the international community for respect for human rights in North Korea, nothing has changed and nothing is changing. Widespread ill treatment, arbitrary detentions and arrests, separated families, fundamental rights and freedoms of North Koreans which are systematically trampled by the regime. Nor should we forget the victims of enforced disappearances, including in South Korea and Japan. The humanitarian situation also remains tragic. The population continues to suffer from food insecurity, alarming detention conditions, and disastrous public health conditions. Nearly 20% of North Korean children are affected by stunting. Madam President, despite repeated calls from the international community, the Pyongyang regime refuses to engage with the various human rights mechanisms of the United Nations. France commends the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and welcomes the work and mission of the Special Rapporteur. Despite a lack of access to the country, she continues to document the human rights situation and violations committed by the regime, and they must continue to be supported in their mandate because it is essential. Madam President, North Korea must end its grave violations and must resume cooperation with the United Nations and immediately comply with international human rights law and international humanitarian law. France calls upon North Korea to re-engage in dialogue with the international community and facilitate the return of international humanitarian personnel and diplomatic missions on its territory. It is essential that the Pyongyang regime allow United Nations staff to return to North Korea and that it guarantees complete, safe, unfettered humanitarian access to the entire territory so that all of the aid needed by the population can reach them. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. I am grateful for the briefing delivered by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk. I also give thanks for the briefing of the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation on human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Ms. Elizabeth Salmon. And I'm grateful for the testimony of Mr. Ilhyeok Kim. I recognize the presence here among us of the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea. When the UN requested that the DPRK deliver its opinion on the implementation of Resolution 4617 of the Human Rights Council, the government of the DPRK responded that it does not recognize the resolutions of that council, resolutions which it believes are products of hostile policies. In that case, how is it possible to argue that the human rights situation in a country must be considered exclusively within the Human Rights Council if that country decides not to comply with the provisions of the relevant resolutions of that body, or even of the General Assembly of the United Nations? With Resolution 77/226 adopted on the 15th of December, the General Assembly condemned the DPRK for diverting its resources towards the development of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, instead of using them to ensure the well-being of its people. I must recall that the Security Council itself has addressed the issue. It's done so in Resolutions 2321 of 2016 and 2371, 2375 and 2397 of the year 2017. These resolutions insisted on the need for the DPRK to respect and ensure the well-being and inherent dignity of its people. At the same time, these resolutions deplored the severe hardships with which the people of that country are forced to endure. Moreover, this council has condemned the DPRK, and I quote, for manufacturing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles instead of ensuring the well-being of its people when that people has major unmet needs. Of course, for Ecuador, there are no good hands in which nuclear weapons can fall. All nuclear weapons are reprehensible, particularly when in 2022, global expenditure on these weapons exceeded $82 billion. And when that expenditure was against the backdrop of growing food insecurity and famine throughout the world. However, the continued deterioration of the situation besetting the people in the DPRK stands in stark contrast with the arms race and the nuclear program, which alone exacerbate tensions on the Korean Peninsula and throughout the world. Moreover, this very council, in the resolutions to which I referred, itself referred to the grave situation of food insecurity besetting the people of the DPRK. Those suffering grave food insecurity included a vast number of pregnant and breastfeeding women, and girls and boys under the age of 5. They were at the risk of malnutrition. Moreover, a quarter of the country's total population suffers chronic malnutrition, and 41% of the population is undernourished. My delegation urges the DPRK to cease its human rights violations and to put an end to its weapons of mass destruction programs and ballistic missile programs. It must do so in a complete, verifiable and irreversible fashion. We also urge the DPRK to resolve the issue of abducted persons and to proceed with their immediate return, including with the immediate return of Japanese nationals and nationals from the Republic of Korea. The conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry on the Human Rights Situation in the DPRK, established 10 years ago now, remain relevant. As a result, I reiterate the fact that it is necessary for the Security Council to continue to examine these conclusions with a view to taking decisions which guarantee accountability and which foster peace and stability in the region and the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. And I begin by noting the objectives for this meeting and reaffirm Ghana's support for the human rights pillar of the work of the United Nations. We thank the briefers for their perspectives and encourage their further efforts in helping and encourage the further efforts of the relevant United Nations bodies in helping the DPRK to fully fulfill its obligation to promote and protect the rights of its citizens. In this regard, we welcome the work of the UN human rights mechanisms on the DPRK and appreciate their efforts to raise awareness on the gaps needed to be addressed to ensure full respect for the human rights of the people of the DPRK. We support the work of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of the human rights in the DPRK and would continue to work constructively within the Third Committee of the General Assembly on the situation of human rights in that country. Madam President, as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we underscore the importance of respect for the entire spectrum of human rights in upholding the dignity of all persons and for the progress and stability of societies. We emphasize the need for human rights issues not to be politicized and for equal attention to be given to economic, social, and cultural rights as is given to civil and political rights. This is important to sustain peace across the globe. This year also marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean Armistice Agreement. The commemoration should spur us all on to foster peace and promote reconciliation. Securing the reunion of separated families is one way of building trust among the Korean people and can also play an important role in promoting reconciliation, peace, and stability on the Korean Peninsula and the region in general. We therefore encourage the DPRK and the Republic of Korea to prioritize work on finding ways to resume reunions online or offline. We appeal to the authorities of the DPRK to release and return the 17 Japanese nationals officially recognized by the government of Japan as having been abducted. We further call on the DPRK authorities to provide the families of all persons who have been abducted or otherwise considered as forcibly disappeared with full information on their fate and whereabouts if they have survived, and allow those who remain alive and their descendants to return immediately to their countries of origin, and in close cooperation with their families and nations of origin, identify and repatriate the physical remains of those who have died. Madam President, Ghana notes the increasing challenges of gathering independent and credible information on the situation of human rights in the DPRK since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. We urge a constructive engagement between the DPRK and the United Nations to support efforts in assuring the human rights of its nationals and addressing the growing humanitarian needs. While concerned by the human rights and humanitarian situation in the DPRK, we firmly hold the view that country-specific human rights questions should be dealt with by the relevant UN human rights bodies, with the narrow and limited exception being instances where systematic and widespread violation of human rights aggravates an ongoing conflict situation, and where a state is either incapable or unwilling to address the matter as verified from independent sources. We therefore express reservations on the Council's further consideration of this matter and urge the appropriate UN human rights bodies and mechanisms with existing mandates to continue efforts to gather all available information and data and report on the human rights situation of the North Korean people. In conclusion, Ghana reiterates her support for the human rights pillar of the work of the United Nations and encourages global respect for human rights and the fundamental freedoms of all persons without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, as called for by Article 1, Paragraph 3 of the United Nations Charter. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
السيدة الرئيسة.
Madam President, I thank High Commissioner Volker Turk for his briefing. We've listened intently to the briefing by the Special Rapporteur on the situation on human rights in the DPRK, Elizabeth Salmon, and to the moving testimony of civil society representative Mr. Kim and his calls to the international community. The UAE condemns the DPRK for continuing to develop its nuclear and ballistic capabilities, which is a clear threat not only to neighboring states but also to international peace and security. We call upon the DPRK to respect international law and to stop its flagrant violations and to comply with relevant Security Council resolutions. This includes stopping any launching of ballistic missiles. Madam President, the UAE attaches great importance to international human rights law, especially the fundamental responsibility of states to protect and promote human rights on its territories and within their jurisdiction. This is a fundamental principle of the United Nations. UN reports on human rights violations in the DPRK are highly worrying, as is sexual and gender violence against women and girls, and the abductions of foreigners and other violations. UN reports indicate that 40% of the people in DPRK are suffering from acute malnutrition, and 20% of children are suffering from stunting. Against this background, my delegation stresses the importance of enhancing cooperation between the DPRK and human rights mechanisms of the United Nations, including cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner. The DPRK must engage positively with these mechanisms, which would contribute in enhancing and promoting human rights. Humanitarian organizations provide their services on the basis of the principles of humanity, impartiality, and neutrality. Their active, non-politicized work has contributed before to improving the situation of civilians in the DPRK. We therefore hope that humanitarian organizations of the UN would be able to go back to the DPRK to provide assistance to those in need. We call the DPRK to give priority to the safety of its people and to channel its limited resources to ensure food security and to meet all developmental needs. In conclusion, Madam President, the UAE stresses the importance of ending the cycle of confrontation, stagnation, and escalation through constructive dialogue and quiet diplomacy, away from provocation and threatening rhetoric. This is the best way to reduce tension and restore trust. This would contribute to achieving peace and security in the Korean Peninsula. We call upon the DPRK to cooperate with UN organizations and international community on issues related to peace, security, non-proliferation, and human rights. At the same time, we stress that this Council must pursue a united approach to deal with threats to international peace and security, including in the Korean Peninsula. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Turk, and the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, Ms. Salmon, for their presentations. We also welcome the participation of Mr. Ilhyeok Kim, and we thank him for his courageous testimony. Each month this year, this Council has been compelled to meet to address the issue of the DPRK's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and it has done so rightly given the threat that these pose to peace and security. On the other hand, it has been almost 6 years now since this Council formally discussed human rights in the DPRK. Indeed, today's meeting is a timely one. We have just heard that serious and systematic violations of human rights continue in the DPRK. We have heard that some violations could even constitute crimes against humanity, and we know that the resources allocated to the costly military and nuclear programs are sorely lacking when it comes to meeting the needs of the people. People that, let's not forget it, is facing increased food insecurity and high levels of poverty. We know that their situation has been made even worse by the increased isolation caused by the pandemic. In addition to the government's political choices, the people's situation is also due to the lack of rapid and unhindered access for humanitarian actors. That access must be guaranteed. In the DPRK, surveillance, coercion, fear, and punishment are used to stifle the freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. The list of human rights violations in the DPRK is long. Torture, arbitrary detention, and the forced removal of political prisoners to camps are just a few examples of the serious and systematic violations. Faced with this grim picture, we recall that human rights are universal, indivisible, and inalienable. We also recall the DPRK's obligation to put an immediate end to all violations. We also recall its obligations pursuant to international human rights law. In particular, the DPRK has ratified the International Covenants on Civil, Political Rights and Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. While every violation of human rights requires a response, the situation of Korean women and girls is equally a cause for concern. As mentioned by the Special Rapporteur, there is a need for effective protection of victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as a policy of prevention. This is in the interest of every society. Finally, the DPRK is also obliged to respect the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Madam President, only justice and accountability can prevent the recurrence of such violations. The fight against impunity for serious human rights violations is therefore of pivotal importance. The perpetrators of human rights violations must be held accountable for their acts. We propose that this Council examine all options at its disposal to guarantee that these violations do not go unpunished. Finally, in order to respond to human rights challenges, we require credible information. This is why we appreciate the efforts of all those, including civil society, who are conducting research on this issue. We also call upon the government of the DPRK to grant access to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and to the Special Rapporteur. Madam President, the grave human rights situation in the DPRK threatens stability and peace in the region and beyond. As a consequence, this Council cannot forget the people of the DPRK. We must work for positive and lasting change for the Korean people. Switzerland encourages member states to continue to engage the DPRK on the issue of human rights, and it calls upon the DPRK to enter into dialogue and to cooperate with international mechanisms. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. Mozambique wishes to pay tribute to Mr. Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for the Human Rights, for his important contribution, not just to this topic, but also to the tireless work in the promotion and protection of human rights around the world. We thank Ms. Elizabeth Salmon, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and Mr. Kim, member of the civil society, for their briefings. We acknowledge the presence in this meeting of the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea. Madam President, since its inception, our organization inscribed in the Charter in a very clear terms our collective faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of human person, in the equal rights of men and women. This is the reason why we believe that protection of human rights is of utmost importance for international peace and security. Moreover, the mandate of the Human Rights Council includes, I quote, to contribute through dialogue and cooperation towards the prevention of human rights violations and respond promptly to human rights emergency, end of quote. Therefore, on the eve of celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Mozambique calls for the need of full compliance with UN Security Council relevant resolutions and all the United Nations instruments related to the protection and promotion of human rights. They can play a major role at creating a peaceful environment in the Korean Peninsula. In this connection, the situation of the Korean Peninsula deserves our attention. We need to take constructive measures aiming to end current tensions and all activities that undermine peace and stability in the region. Furthermore, it is imperative to build bridges of dialogue, foster mutual trust, and relaunch peace between the two neighboring countries and the region as a whole. Mozambique supports all efforts undertaken by the members of this Council, as well as by all other members of the United Nations in the promotion and maintenance of international peace and security to ease the persistent tensions in the Korean Peninsula and initiate a constructive and trustful dialogue leading to a lasting peace and stability. In conclusion, all efforts of the members of this Council should be focused on promoting dialogue and building trust between all parties through diplomatic efforts and initiatives for dialogue to promote peace and security in the region in order to end tensions in the Korean Peninsula. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, dear colleagues, I thank Mr. Volker Turk and Ms. Elizabeth Salmon for their comprehensive briefings, and Mr. Ilhyeok Kim for his testimony. Brazil's position has consistently been that debates on human rights issues should take place in the appropriate fora. Those discussions are most effective when they avoid accusations of selectivity and seek to implement rights for all. Brazil defended the creation in 2006 of a constructive, universal, non-selective, and non-politicized forum for human rights in Geneva. For that reason, we are an active participant of the Human Rights Council as well as of other bodies dedicated to this matter of utmost importance. Recognizing that Rule 2 provides for the Presidency for calling a meeting at any member's request, it is our duty to recall that the object of the meeting must be within the mandate of the Council. Madam President, Brazil remains concerned about the persistent reports of systematic violations of human rights in the DPRK and has participated in discussions on the subject in the appropriate United Nations bodies. Brazil has also supported resolutions concerning the situation of human rights in the DPRK, both in the Human Rights Council and in the Third Committee of the General Assembly. We have been equally vocal in drawing attention to the grave humanitarian situation faced by the country's civilian population. We continue to be troubled by findings of the panel of experts that conclude that the sanctions regime in itself has had unintended impacts on the humanitarian situation. We must do more to reduce these impacts. We therefore reiterate our call for a sustained process of engagement with the DPRK. Only through dialogue can the many issues in the file begin to be addressed, including the human rights situation in all its dimensions. Isolation does not help the people of the DPRK, nor does it bring us closer to our goal of a Korean peninsula that is peaceful, stable, and free of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, China opposes the Council's consideration of the human rights situation in the DPRK. That position is crystal clear. According to the UN Charter, the primary responsibility of the Council is the maintenance of international peace and security, not addressing human rights issues. The human rights situation in the DPRK does not pose a threat to international peace and security. At present, the international situation is fraught with change and turmoil, with crises and challenges of all kinds. The world in which we live is facing rising instability and uncertainty. The Council should focus on fulfilling its responsibility under the Charter, striving to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes, the resolution of geopolitical confrontations, and dealing with major and urgent issues that threaten international peace and security. For some time now, the situation on the peninsula has remained tense, and confrontation has intensified. All parties should exercise calm and restraint, do more for peace and stability, and refrain from mutual provocation and escalatory words and deeds. At this complex and sensitive time, the Council should play a constructive role in resuming talk and easing tensions. Pushing the Council to consider the human rights situation in the DPRK will not only not help to ease, but escalate the situation. It is irresponsible, unconstructive, and an abuse of the Council's power. If the relevant country
is really concerned about the regional peace and stability and the welfare of the people of DPRK, they should take concrete actions and make concrete proposals to promote mutual trust and resume talk. Support the adjustment of the sanctions against the DPRK, especially in the area of people's livelihoods, and immediately lift the unilateral coercive measures that have led to the deterioration of the human rights situation in the country. The question of the peninsula, as a remnant of the Cold War, has protracted until today. It is essentially a political and security issue. The hype on the human rights issue of the DPRK in the forum of the Security Council, in an attempt to divert attention, shirk responsibility, and exert pressure, will not help the resolution of the issue, but it will only do harm. What relevant party should really do, what relevant countries should really do, is to show political will, take practical actions to respond to reasonable concerns of DPRK, and make efforts and create conditions for the resumption of talk. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that China always commits to the maintenance of peace and stability, denuclearization, and the resolution through dialogue and consultation on the peninsula. We're ready to continue to play a constructive role in promoting a political solution to the question of the peninsula and the realization of long-lasting peace and stability in Northeast Asia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I thank High Commissioner Turk and Special Rapporteur Salmon for their valuable contributions. I also thank Mr. Kim for his powerful and courageous testimony. Malta recognizes the inextricable link between human rights and advancing international peace and security. We commend the work of human rights bodies and mechanisms, such as the Human Rights Council, who continue to highlight the long list of human rights violations occurring within the DPRK, despite the complete lack of cooperation by state authorities. It is almost 10 years since the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK exposed systematic, widespread, and grave violations amounting to crimes against humanity. These violations continue to persist and are intrinsically linked to the threats posed by the DPRK to international peace and security. We call on the DPRK to adhere to its international obligations under Security Council resolutions. It must completely, verifiably, and irreversibly abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile programs and return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and IAEA safeguards. We urge the DPRK to sign and ratify the CTBT. President, civilians in the DPRK continue to live in a climate of government-induced fear. As we have heard today from our briefers, the humanitarian situation in the DPRK remains dire, with severe levels of food insecurity and large segments of the population enduring chronic malnutrition. Children are especially impacted by the situation. North Korean authorities must allow international humanitarian organizations rapid and unhindered assistance to the most vulnerable groups, including prisoners. We deplore reports of the regime using food as a method of state control, with the diversion of resources to military objectives that include the numerous ballistic missile launches witnessed in the past year. The systematic restrictions of the freedoms of thought and expression and movement are deeply troubling. Arbitrary arrests, detentions, and forced disappearances, which also impact the extended families of those accused of being, quote, traitors, close quote, continue through the regime's vast use of detention centers and prisons. President, discrimination against women and girls due to widespread gender stereotypes and normative deficits prevent gender equality from being realized. The low-level market activities have made them targets of regime control. As Special Rapporteur Salmon has noted, the North Korean authorities subject women in detention to inhumane conditions that include torture, forced labor, sexual violence, and the privation of food. We concur with her recommendation to address the patriarchal root causes of gender-based violence, to promote women's awareness of their rights, and to engage men as part of the solution to ending violence against women. Furthermore, reports concerning forced child labour are disturbing, despite claims by the DPRK denying such practices. Such practices are a grave violation of children's rights. The DPRK has also abducted foreign nationals outside its borders, many of whom remain unaccounted for. Malta calls on the DPRK to provide full information about all those kidnapped and unlawfully detained and to immediately release all abductees. We stress that the DPRK government must be held accountable for its abhorrent practices against its own people, including the trafficking of women and girls and exploitation of children. The DPRK must meaningfully cooperate with UN human rights bodies and to initiate a dialogue with the Special Rapporteur and Special Procedure thematic mandate holders and invite them to carry out official country visits. President, we further call on states to fully implement their obligations under the sanctions regime and refrain from engaging in or assisting with any sanctions violations. The use of revenue generated by North Korean workers overseas to fund the DPRK's illegal weapons program also constitutes human exploitation. We call on states to repatriate all DPRK nationals earning income in their jurisdiction in full accordance with international law. President, in conclusion, I would like to remind the Council of our shared objective: peace and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Human rights are not optional, nor are they an isolated concern. They are the foundation upon which a stable and peaceful Korean Peninsula must be built. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. Today we are once again witnessing a shameless attempt by members of the Security Council from among the Western states and the American presidency itself to use the Council to advance their own self-serving politicized agenda. This meeting is in no way linked to the developments on the ground and was not initially included on the draft program of work proposed by the American presidency at the beginning of the month. It's clear that, understanding how provocative this idea was, our American colleagues tried to avoid the well-founded criticisms of members of the Security Council. The fact that this provocation was planned in advance is indicated by the fact that Albania, the United States and Japan circulated among the members a concept note that they'd cooked up calling for Council members to focus discussions on discussing the human rights situation in the DPRK in the context of international peace and security. I'd like to underscore that these sorts of notes are circulated according to long-standing practice only by the presidency of the Security Council in relation to the signature events that they are organizing, where the presidency genuinely does have an opportunity to independently determine the subject and format of the discussion. This then makes us wonder, Madam President, is today's meeting another signature event of your presidency? And if it is, why was it not properly announced at the beginning of the month? And if it isn't, then on what basis have you, together with Albania and Japan, assigned yourself the right to steer discussions in the Security Council? These actions on your part are nothing other than a gross violation of established practice in the Council's work. The steps that you have taken are unjustified. They serve purely propaganda purposes and contradict the mandate of the UN Security Council. Human rights, as is well known, does not fall within that mandate. That is discussed in relevant fora, first and foremost the UN Human Rights Council and also the Third Committee of the General Assembly. Any attempt to link human rights to international peace and security, or threats to international peace and security advanced by the backers of today's meeting, is absolutely artificial. Moreover, attempts to introduce into the work of the Security Council issues that do not fall within its mandate divide its attention, politicize the discussion, and thus undermine the authority of the Council in general. It's clear that convening today's meeting is nothing other than a cynical and hypocritical attempt by the US and its allies to advance their own political agenda, to step up pressure on Pyongyang, and to distract attention from the reckless escalatory actions of Washington and its allies in the region. They are the ones that are creating a real threat to international peace and security. There is no need to once again in detail describe what we're talking about. Everyone is well aware that the USA, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, as part of their so-called extended deterrence policy, are continuing to strengthen their military activity in the region. One of the main trends is the increasingly large-scale nature of the exercises they're carrying out and increasing military cooperation. Recently, the world has also witnessed the appearance of an American nuclear submarine off the Korean peninsula and US-South Korean air maneuvers involving US fighters and strategic bombers. Nor should we forget plans to redeploy part of NATO's military infrastructure to the region. We are also hearing dangerous signals about plans from Japan and the Republic of Korea to intensify cooperation with the USA in the nuclear sphere, going as far as the possible deployment on their territory of American nuclear weapons and also the development of their own ones. Russia has consistently opposed any military activity that would jeopardize the security of the Korean peninsula and that of the countries of Northeast Asia. Dangerous actions and statements directly contradict the goal of easing tensions around the peninsula and finding means for a political diplomatic settlement to the situation, which is enshrined in the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. And this is against the backdrop of the clearly expressed position of the DPRK, and also the lengthy history of the issue, which clearly indicates that there is no way to resolve the problems that exist other than through dialogue and constructive interaction, taking into account the legitimate concerns and rights of all of the states involved, including, of course, the DPRK. Recent events only further confirm that refraining from provocative acts and returning to the negotiating table is the only possible way to resolve any problems. And in that connection, I would once again like to draw attention to the Russian-Chinese plan of action on the comprehensive settlement of the situation surrounding the Korean peninsula, which involves concrete steps in various areas. Distinguished colleagues, this is clear hypocrisy on the part of the USA and their allies, who, even as they speak about human rights in the DPRK, continue to consistently suffocate the North Korean people through inhumane unilateral sanctions. Today, we've not heard from UN representatives or the Western colleagues anything about how, as a result of these measures, people are suffering. This further indicates how pointless today's discussion is, the only aim of which is to cater to Western double standards, both when it comes to the work of the Security Council and also on human rights. We are convinced that our Council and the UN in general must not indulge the policy of the US and its allies to use human rights as a pretext for interfering in the internal affairs of states. These actions represent the main threat to peace and security, something that dozens of states in various different regions of the world have been able to see for themselves. And no amount of maneuvering by Washington and its allies is going to fool anyone here. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russia for their statement. I now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank High Commissioner Turk, Special Rapporteur Salmon for their briefing. I also, like others, pay tribute to Mr. Kim for his powerful testimony. And I welcome the presence of the representative of the Republic of Korea at this meeting. President, the United Kingdom remains deeply concerned by the appalling human rights situation in the DPRK. It is clear that human rights violations remain widespread, systematic, and completely lacking in accountability. So I also thank Albania, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the United States for bringing this issue back to the Council for the first time since 2017. Human rights in the DPRK and international peace and security are inextricably linked. The DPRK authorities divert resources from people's basic economic needs towards their illegal nuclear and ballistic weapons program. These illegal weapons are financed through forced labor, with workers sent overseas, often under modern slavery conditions. I urge all UN member states, especially the DPRK, to fully implement Resolution 2397, including on overseas workers, and end this exploitation. The DPRK continues to reject UN resolutions on the situation of human rights in North Korea. It refuses to cooperate with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights or with the UN Special Rapporteur. The regime fails to acknowledge the 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry report that concluded wide-ranging human rights violations taking place in the country may amount to crimes against humanity. The United Kingdom also recognises the suffering of other nationals who've been abducted by the DPRK, and we call for their return. Forced repatriations, state-sponsored abductions, and enforced disappearances demand action. We remind all members to respect the principle of non-refoulement and not forcibly return those who've escaped the DPRK to face threats to their safety and human rights. Colleagues, the human rights situation has not improved while the Council has remained silent. We urge the DPRK to prioritise the well-being of its citizens over the development of its illegal weapons programmes. We remind the DPRK that its restrictive COVID-19 measures must be proportionate, not used as a tool to further constrain the freedom of its citizens or to restrict the ability of the international community to engage with the authorities in Pyongyang. And we urge them to engage in a genuine and positive spirit with the UN Special Rapporteur to bring around permanent change and improvements for the people of North Korea. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk, and the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Ms. Elizabeth Salmon. I thank them both for their briefings. I listened closely to the briefing delivered by Mr. Kim. We welcome to this meeting the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea. Madam President, I wish to emphasize two concerns which are essential in our view. The first is that my country is committed to the unconditional respect of human rights by everyone and wherever they are under threat. And we believe that all situations in which human persons are deprived of their fundamental freedoms must be followed up upon. That includes being deprived of their economic rights. These situations need to be monitored. We condemn all infringements to human rights, and we condemn all attempts to politicize human rights or to treat them with through a lens of double standards. Because human rights are universal, they are indivisible, and they are inalienable. In this connection, my country's position is unambiguous. We believe that human rights situations, including those concerning the DPRK, must be broached within the Human Rights Council and within the Third Committee. These bodies are the bodies with a remit par excellence within the United Nations system to examine human rights violations. The second concern I wish to air relates to the need to achieve a settlement regarding the military situation of the DPRK. That needs to be achieved through diplomatic channels. For several months, we have noted with concern that there is a radicalization and a hardening of positions, manifesting itself of an escalation of military deterrence in an unprecedented fashion. We're seeing increased missile firing, and it's taking on a worrying scope, and there is a nuclear risk. This climate of tension is a threat not only to the whole of the Korean peninsula, but also to international peace and security. My country has clearly and repeatedly expressed its opposition to missile diplomacy and to inflammatory rhetoric that underpins it. We reiterate our appeal once again to all parties to prioritize dialogue and negotiation on the basis of international law in order to put an end to the threat hovering over the Korean peninsula. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. The representative of Japan has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
There was a reference by one of the member councils to the security policy of Japan with regard to nuclear weapons. So I want to make the following point crystal clear. The three non-nuclear principles: not producing, not possessing, and not allowing the entry of the nuclear weapons, continues to be our basic policy. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to begin by thanking the U.S. Presidency for convening this important meeting, as well as the Security Council members supporting the meeting. My gratitude also goes to High Commissioner Mr. Turk and the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, Ms. Salmon, for their excellent briefings, as well as a special briefer, Mr. Kim Ilhyeok, for his courage in sharing his precious and personal account. Early this year, 61 UN member states and the European Union, double the number from last year, sent a letter to request the Security Council to remain seized of the human rights situation in the DPRK in pursuit of a Public Security Council meeting. On behalf of the government of the Republic of Korea and the Korean people, I am grateful to see this request accepted here today after waiting for more than 5 years. As a fellow Korean, I am aware of the immensity of the critical task before me, informing the world of the grim reality facing 25 million North Korean people by delivering a statement only several minutes long. Today, we are not addressing human rights violations in any conflict or war zones, as we often do at the Security Council. We are instead addressing human rights violations in one of the most tightly controlled member states in the world, where systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations amounting to crimes against humanity take place. DPRK is an example of a perfectly functioning totalitarian system that controls the physical, mental, and intellectual activities of its entire population on a daily basis. The landmark report released in 2014 by the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK stated that, I quote, "The gravity, scale, and nature of these violations reveal a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world," unquote. The DPRK's human rights violations are in clear contravention of the universal values enshrined in the UN Charter and constitute a threat to international peace and security. The COI report clearly recommended that the Security Council should refer the DPRK human rights situation to the International Criminal Court. It also recommended that the Council should adopt targeted sanctions against those who appear to be most responsible for crimes against humanity. Regrettably, since its last meeting in 2017, the Security Council hasn't been able to convene publicly to address DPRK human rights, while the situation remains desperate with no signs of improvement. In addition, severe economic hardship and associated chronic food shortages have been exacerbated by the DPRK regime's self-imposed isolation during the pandemic and the new market-distorting policy adopted last year, banning private transactions of grain. At the same time, over the last 1.5 years, the DPRK has been engaging in an unprecedented escalation of its WMD provocations, including launches of 12 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Instead of addressing its critical food shortages, the DPRK regime has continually squandered its scarce resources on a dangerous show of force and advancement of its WMD technology. Madam President, the DPRK's human rights abuses of its bizarre dynastic regime. As highlighted at today's meeting, the DPRK human rights and the WMD issues are intertwined in a very real ways. Focusing on WMDs at the expense of its own people's well-being by diverting resources is only possible in a country where all political dissent is crushed. Moreover, domestic and overseas forced labor under heavy surveillance has served as one of the major sources of funds for the regime's unlawful weapons program. Therefore, by failing to address the human rights situation, we cannot hope to resolve the nuclear issue either. We should take a holistic approach toward the DPRK issues at the Security Council and clearly demonstrate that justice must prevail. Madam President, there are still roughly 100,000 people detained in political prison camps, enduring a life of acute misery with only the remotest chance of being released alive. The regime also operates a long-standing system that punishes citizens for offenses allegedly committed by members of their family. Furthermore, the DPRK regime is a perpetrator of human rights violations beyond its territory. In her report to the Human Rights Council this year, Special Rapporteur Ms. Salmon detailed the Japanese cases of 12 abductees and the Korean cases of abductions and enforced disappearances. Up to 100,000 Korean civilian abductees during the Korean War, 516 Korean post-war abductees, and roughly 500 surviving prisoners of war held in the DPRK since 1953. Yet another astonishing recent development is the adoption of a series of highly oppressive laws, including the so-called Law on Rejecting Reactionary Ideology and Culture in 2020, the Youth Education Guarantee Law in 2021, and the Pyongyang Cultural Language Protection Law in 2023. As a result, simply watching or sharing South Korean TV dramas or movies is now punishable by death in the DPRK. These horrendous living conditions have continually forced the North Korean people to flee across the border, mainly to China, despite draconian measures such as orders to shoot to kill on sight. It is both horrifying and heartbreaking to witness North Korean escapees risking everything, including their lives, on their long, arduous road to freedom. We are deeply concerned about the issue of DPRK defectors detained in third countries. The OHCHR continues to document serious human rights violations when a third country repatriated them to the DPRK, including torture and other cruel, degrading treatment. In this regard, we would like to remind member states that the principle of non-refoulement should be observed. Against this backdrop, we cannot simply turn a blind eye to this reality by insisting that discussing the DPRK situation in the Security Council risks politicizing human rights. In fact, it is the DPRK regime that uses human rights abuses as a critical means of governance to achieve its political goals. What it does to the outside world is a natural extension of what it does inside. The Security Council's neglect could further put international peace and security at risk. Madam President, the Republic of Korea remains the country most affected by the DPRK's human rights violations and its violent attacks, including presidential assassination attempts, while being within direct range as a military target. However, we never forget that people in the DPRK are our brothers and sisters. Bearing this in mind, my government released its first ever public report on the DPRK human rights situation this year. The Republic of Korea, during its upcoming term in the Security Council, will continue to make every effort to improve the DPRK situation, both human rights and non-proliferation, by building upon the momentum gained at today's meeting. In concluding, I'd like to share my reflections. from a recent encounter with 10 young North Korean defectors, all of whom shared their own extraordinary stories like the briefer today. We should all contemplate on the lives of the North Korean young people who are growing up in a society with rampant brainwashing and indoctrination, completely disconnected with no outside information. What the international community, including my country, ought to do is to figure out and take action on how we can give the hope of freedom and human dignity to this young future generation. After all, our sisters and brothers in North Korea should live the lives they deserve, just like all of us. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you, guys. Great job.
No, they just gotta blurt it out.
We got a big crowd, so it'll take us a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Come around. And there's space behind me. Yeah, come on. Closer. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. If you would give me a moment, I'd love to read the names of all of the people who are here with me today. And I'd like to deliver the statement in my national capacity on behalf of the 52 member states: the United States, Albania, Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Ecuador, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Guatemala, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Moldova, Monaco, Montenegro, Netherlands, North Macedonia, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Romania, San Marino, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, as well as the European Union. Today, the Security Council met to discuss the link between the DPRK's human rights violations and abuses and international peace and security. This was the first open briefing on this issue since 2017. Earlier this year, 62 co-sponsors, double the year prior, signed a letter requesting the Security Council remain seized with the human rights situation in the DPRK. Today, the Security Council lived up to that expectation. The DPRK government's violations and abuses have been well documented by credible accounts, including numerous UN experts, and have been condemned through many General Assembly resolutions adopted by consensus over the past years. They include arbitrary killings, harsh and life-threatening prison sentences, the punishment of family members for offenses allegedly committed by an individual, and near total state control of expression through censorship and repression. The DPRK government commits acts of cruelty and repression in its own territory, while also perpetrating similar acts in other countries targeting both citizens of the DPRK and others. These include executions, assassinations, abductions, including from Japan and the Republic of Korea, intimidations, and forced repatriation. Alone, these human rights violations and abuses demand the Council's attention. But they are also inextricably linked with the DPRK's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile development, ballistic missile advancement in violation of Security Council resolutions. The DPRK government engages in domestic and overseas forced labor and labor exploitation to generate revenue for its unlawful weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs. And the DPRK's repressive political climate allows the government to divert resources to weapons development at the expense of the welfare of the people in the DPRK who suffer from severe economic hardship and malnutrition. None of this is acceptable, and there continues to be a lack of accountability. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 30th anniversary of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and the 10th anniversary of the creation of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK. And while we've made great strides forward, we still have a long way to go when it comes to the situation in the DPRK. Last December, many of us stood before you and urged the Security Council to hold an open briefing in 2023 to discuss the DPRK's human rights violations and abuses. And we're pleased to announce that our group of support has grown and that we have succeeded in our objective. We now call on all member states to join us in raising awareness of the links between human rights situations in the DPRK and international peace and security, and to hold the DPRK government accountable for its actions and fully implement Security Council resolutions. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, can you give any update on the intelligence on upcoming missile tests by North Korea?
I don't have anything on that, thank you.
Or anything on Travis King, the U.S. soldier?
Nothing on that either. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, which other human rights records will you be raising? Which countries' human rights records will you be raising at council level?
We've raised DPRK and we've raised other countries during our month because we have decided we're going to focus on human rights, not just regularly in the council, but we're going to focus on human rights intensely during this month, and that's what we have done.
China's human rights record?